Hi, you're listening to The Sociology Show, a podcast about absolutely anything to do with the wonderful world of sociology. Whether you're a teacher, a lecturer, a student, or just taking a passing interest, this podcast will look at a range of issues from social class, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, crime, education, and anything else that sociology has to offer. My name is Matthew Wilkin, and each episode I will speak to someone working in the field of sociology and let them explain all about their own interests, their research, and their experiences. So, put your earphones in, turn the volume up, and let's be sociology geeks together, eh? Hello and welcome to The Sociology Show. The Sociology Show podcast is brought to you in association with Tutor2U Sociology, the exam performance specialist for A-level and GCSE sociology students and teachers. And so you can visit tutor2u.net/sociology, and there you can pick up revision guides, revision videos, flashcards, and everything else that you need for your A-level or GCSE sociology studies. And so on to this episode, and my guest for this episode is Dr. Alex Blower. Alex, thank you for joining me.
No problem at all. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Do you want to start by introducing yourself, Alex? Tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm probably not the traditional kind of academic you might have on the Sociology Show, really. The vast majority of the work that I do at the moment is in widening access to higher education. So I work for universities and do a load of stuff with, young people and school groups geared towards providing them with the resources to access higher education. As I've kind of evolved in that job, I guess, because I started about 10 years ago, in 2016, I did started my PhD research, which is in an issue that's very closely related to kind of widening access to higher education and also my own experiences. And now I kind of work as a kind of bridge between the two, really. I'm still quite involved in research, but also, I do a lot of work that's more getting projects up and running to hopefully level the playing field a bit when it comes to access to university.
Great. And we'll come back onto your research in a moment. When did you first get into the subject yourself, Alex?
So it was a bit of a roundabout way, really. I first encountered sociology when I was doing my A-levels, and as a student I had a bit of a kind of interrupted educational trajectory, I guess. I'm from quite a working class town in the West Midlands, and due to a number of different things that had happened, when I was about 14 I was asked to leave the school that was in my hometown. I got expelled and I ended up moving to a school that was about 6 miles down the road, that was in a lot more posh, a lot more middle class area. The differences between those two schools were absolutely massive, just reflecting back now where I am. And I think probably me going to that school resulted in me doing A-levels and going on into higher education eventually as well. And sociology, when I encountered it for A-level, was really the first time I'd started to develop tools or way of thinking to understand what was going on around me, I guess, a little bit more. And it absolutely fascinated me. I didn't end up studying it at university. I went and did drama, which is completely different. And I did that for undergraduate and for my master's as well. But when I left university, one of the first jobs that I had after working in a hostel for homeless young people for a while was in widening access to HE. And I reflected back, using the data that we have available to kind of target students and areas to work with, and had a look at my home postcode. And for the school that I went to, I think the participation rate in higher education was about 25%. And for the school that I moved to in that more middle class area, it was up to about 63%. So, for me, looking back, that was huge. Just moving schools and having that happen to me automatically appeared to, according to these statistics, make me 3 times more likely to go to higher education. And that struck me as really unfair. I've got loads of mates with more talent in their little fingers than I've got in my whole body. So an opportunity came up to do some research that was in kind of widening access to higher education. And Yeah, that's kind of really where I got back into to sociology. Sociology is really, when you're talking about inequality in society, that, the perfect tool to mobilize to start exploring these things further. So yeah, it was a lot of learning very quickly,
Yeah.
given my drama background. But yeah, something that I feel like has developed not only my interest in the subject, but also my understanding of the world around me an awful lot over the last 4 or 5 years.
I'm just wondering, based on what you just said, whether Marxism was kind of the key theory that you're interested in, being so interested in social class.
Yeah, well, I learned kind of a range back when I was doing my A levels, but the one that I've really mobilised for my research and for my PhD has been, well, grounded in the work of Pierre Bourdieu.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was some theorists called Hodgkinson and Sparks that kind of developed upon Bourdieu's work to create this sociological theory of career decision making, and that idea that your identity is made up through lived experiences of these varieties of different resources that you've got access to, and how legitimate they are in certain spaces was really, really fascinating.
Hmm.
And then how that related, to my own experiences, if I applied a theoretical lens like Bourdieu to some of those transitions that I had in education, then it was really, really interesting to see the types of capital, or reflect on the types of capital that were the ones that were privileged in the school in my working class town, compared to the one at this other school that I moved to, where perhaps all of a sudden, the way that the cultural capital was presented was one where you were cool if you engaged educationally as a boy, and it was seen as a good thing to do, which was quite different to how it was perceived in the school that I originally came from.
So I just wonder if you'd never been expelled, Alex, we probably wouldn't be having this chat right now.
No, and it's so strange how these things, yeah, come around and work out. Absolutely. Yeah, and what I've really enjoyed throughout kind of developing my knowledge and, skills as a researcher within sociology is that ability to articulate some of these things, that could perhaps be thoughts and feelings about certain situations, that you've always kind of tacitly known, but actually there's such wonderful kind of frames of reference out there for you to be able to describe them in a way that creates that shared understanding, if you like.
Yeah, that's right. That it becomes reality rather than just theoretical.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And going back to Bourdieu, I mean, that's the theorist that really resonated with me. And I think something that Bourdieu does particularly well is the relational nature of all of these things. So the way that you will interact with the space will interact with you, and kind of the rules of the game being dictated by all of these kind of powers and forces that might be in wider fields or wider society.
Yeah, and I can see how that links into your own research about widening access to higher education. So, do you want to tell us a little bit more about that, Alex?
Yeah, absolutely. So my research took place in the Black Country in the West Midlands, and it was conducted at a single school, which was kind of a case study. And essentially, I was interested in conducting research with white working class males within this particular institution, and examining how this institution firstly deployed resources to develop these students' expectations towards their future in education and work. Also on the student side, how they accessed and mobilized these capitals towards forming those future expectations. And then the third bit was looking at the influence of the student social networks. So, family members, friends, and the capital that they had available and were perhaps able to mobilize on these individuals' behalf, which also influenced the formation of those future expectations.
Could I ask you about your kind of sample and methodology that you used there then?
Yeah, absolutely. So it was a qualitative study, and the school, it was a single school in the Black Country that I worked with. I conducted semi-structured interviews with a number of staff members at the school, but also within the study, I had three core participants. the three core participants, I spent about 3 months either in the school or near it, building rapport. And at the end of that kind of rapport building phase, then we conducted semi-structured interviews. At the end of those interviews, I then asked these core participants to identify members of their social network who were particularly influential, or who they might have gone to for advice and guidance about future in education and work. If they were stuck about what subjects they might want to do for A levels, for instance, who they would go to. One of the participants, so the core participants, there was 3 in total, 2 current students at the school and 1 individual who was a teacher at the institution, but was from a white working class background himself, and he actually attended the school that I was conducting the research with. So I had 2 current students who were kind of going into year 11 and navigating all of those tough decisions you have at that particular time, and Mr. D, the participant, who was kind of a more retrospective account. So he had arguably become socially mobile at that time. He had gone from a working class background into a position that could be described as quite a middle class profession as a teacher, and with him it was a lot more of an exploration of the processes of gaining the relevant resources that he would need to achieve that, and how he went about it, and who was influential.
And so the 2 students, were they planning to go on to do their A levels and eventually into higher education, or were they on that cusp of not quite sure what to do?
Well, both of them weren't quite sure exactly how it was going to pan out, but they had very, very different perspectives. So one of them, Chris, was looking a lot more kind of locally at colleges of further education. The other individual that I interviewed, the participant, was much more looking at eventual kind of progression to higher education, maybe studying A levels and going to a university that might involve getting really good grades to go on to. What was really interesting within their stories and their negotiations were the influences of those members of their social network. If you look at the Black Country as a region, it was one that was very industrialized kind of in the 70s, and it lost a lot of its manufacturing and its industry. And you could see within these students' narratives how they were drawing on the information that was available through their social networks to kind of form those future intentions. Another big thing as well was the idea of risk and the things that these students might have to undertake, perhaps without too much support, in order to achieve those goals that were often held up as the aspirational objective. When we talk about access to higher education, we talk about widening participation at university, then an awful lot of the time what is seen as the most legitimate kind of trajectory is you become socially mobile through going to university, but not only that, you become geographically mobile, and actually moving away to say Oxford and studying PPE or whatever it might be is held up as that gold standard, and other experiences of higher education are seen as perhaps not quite that. And when I was speaking to staff in the school and talking about the practices they deployed, when they were talking about examples of students that had gone on from the school to do well, in their view, then it was always 1 or 2 examples of those students who had become socially and geographically mobile and gone to, those higher tariff Russell Group universities that had moved away from home. And I found that particularly interesting when it came to the students and the resources perhaps they had access to in order to formulate expectations towards those trajectories, and what was being held up by the school perhaps as that gold standard of what they'd want a student to do.
It's kind of reminded me of, the comedian Frank Skinner, who's from a similar part of the world, and his biography, who's the first in his family to kind of go into university, and that navigation of social class, but also masculinity as well, and what it meant to be reading something like English, and how that was kind of interpreted by the people around him.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I reflected on it in my own experiences as well there earlier. The idea that perhaps in certain educational spaces, and there's been kind of a lot of research, I think Diane Ray's touched on it quite a bit with her work, where it talks about that idea of what it means to be cool and accepted within your peer group, within, say, a classroom in a working class school, in a working class town, compared to what it might be in a more middle class space, where actually an investment in the capital that you can draw from getting those educational um, credentials is something that's actually seen as something that the cool kids could do. Really played into some of the dialogue with my participants, and actually how they negotiated what could be seen as subverting or doing something different from what was seen as this normative kind of working class masculinity, and how that practice played out in the classroom was really fascinating as well. And when I go back to talking about that risk, often when you talk about access to higher education, the risk just appears to be financial, but actually for the students that I was engaging with, then there were a multitude of different risks coming from a lot of different places. One of the theories that I used within the PhD research was it was the idea of embedded and contingent choosers, and the idea that with the capital or the resources that you have available, you've got something that might be an embedded choice, one that's familiar, one that's safe, one that is perhaps low risk, compared to a contingent choice, which is one that is completely outside of the experiences of not just you as an individual, but also your family members, your friends, your social network. So actually, if you are for it could be argued, the students in my study, the contingent choice was, that gold standard of going away to a Russell Group university and studying this particular course, whilst the embedded choice might be following similar career paths and trajectories to their friends and family members, ones that were more safe and familiar. And within that context, if you're looking at what was normal, what was taking place in the classroom, then actually, it was perhaps an anti-school subculture that fitted in with that. And if you were doing something different within the classroom, then you were contravening kind of those things that were widely accepted as the ways that things work if you're a white working class male in that setting with your peer group.
Yeah, it very much connects to the classic Paul Willis Learning to Labour study of the 70s, but it sounds like some similarities even today.
Yeah, absolutely. But what I would say also is there's a lot of it is not quite a lot of the time, when you talk about white working class students or white working class students in general, then there tends to be, a very generalized view. And something that really came out, even with the individuals in my study, was how nuanced and different an individual their experiences were. And there was so much going on that was influenced by not only the socioeconomic position that they might find themselves in, but the locality that they were in and the geography in the Black country, but also those historical experiences as well, which all combine, within the habitus of this individual student that gives them those capitals to engage or interact or relate with the educational space and formation of those future expectations. So yeah, but I mean, Willis and kind of that study in the 70s was a big starting point for the research, but there's been some fantastic work by the likes of Mike Ward and Stephen Roberts that really kind of develop that further and check that change of the consequences of deindustrialization on working class masculinities. And if you look at Nicola Ingram, for example, as well, that the idea of social mobility, and some Nicola Ingram's were kind of a big influence on the research that I did. And I think the way that she manages to conceptualize what it means for a student to become educationally successful, or start that journey of social mobility, and the consequences that it can have for the identity of the students, was really rich. And I certainly drew on that a lot within my own research.
Yeah, understandable. Great researcher, Nicola, certainly. Thank you, Alex. That's going to be the end of part 1. And in part 2, we're going to discuss your research in a little bit more detail.
The Sociology Show podcast relies on the kind contributions of sponsorship and donations. If you enjoy the show, then you can help with the hosting costs by donating as little as £5 on the GoFundMe page. Simply visit uk.gofundme.com and search for The Sociology Show. If you can donate, then you will be sent a Sociology Show pen as a small thank you for your continued support of the show.
Hello and welcome back to part 2 of this Sociology Show. I'm talking to Dr. Alex Blower. Alex, I was intrigued to delve a little bit deeper because your research is not just about working class males, but particularly white working class males. Could I start by asking you, is there any controversy in researching that? And I've asked that for a particular reason.
Is that particular reason? Because yes is the likely answer.
The reason I ask is, I've got students in A levels for very frequently to look at researchers who've studied anything to do with ethnicity and educational success, and they can find a lot of research to do with black students and a lot of research to do with Asian students, and very little to do with white students. Even though evidence is showing us that white working class boys in particular are right at the lower levels of performance.
Yeah, for me, I think that there is a lot going on at the moment with the government when it comes to white working class boys and educational success. Certainly, if you look at the HE participation rates, white working class boys are amongst the lowest of kind of any demographic or group if you split it up. However, I would argue that it's not an issue that is related so much to ethnicity as it is to an issue that relates to class and a certain kind of social historical experience in certain parts of the country that are shared by a very, very large amount of people. Usually that links to things like deindustrialization, and a lot of the opportunities for work and employment kind of drying up, and a new neoliberal agenda which really focused on those sharp elbows and social mobility and making your way up to the top. The reason that my research has a specific focus on white working class males is that due to my own educational experiences, it was one where I felt I had a legitimate voice as a researcher.
Yeah.
When we talk about, and when I conduct my research with white working class students, it's because those boys or those individuals are a group through my personal experience that I have an identification with, and the inequality in the way it works. It works on intersections, and when it comes to the students that I studied, then it was very much that intersection of the socioeconomic position, that shared historical kind of collective experience, which I think Diane Ray summarizes quite nicely in one of the papers that she's written, that I particularly wanted to unpick. For me, when we're talking about these working class students, it's most important that it's the working class students with that collective memory, if you like, that's important, rather than the fact that these students happen to be students of a white ethnicity. And I think that we could identify numerous examples of where intersections of race and class come together to make things incredibly difficult for people from a whole host of different backgrounds. So for me, it was a mix with the research of personal experience and my ability to relate to the subject, to have a legitimate voice within the space as a researcher when I was conducting the research. Although there are some statistics that suggest at the moment, progression to HE for white working class males are very, very low. It wasn't as much of a driving force because those students were white, if that makes sense. Sorry, yeah. I'm not sure if I've articulated that as well as I possibly could.
It does make sense, Alex. What I was thinking is I fear that people are a little bit concerned about tackling the issue, but we have to. If we've got a certain group, even though it's intersectional, if we've got a certain group that is underperforming and at the bottom of the pile, if you like, in terms of success, we can't ignore it. We can't brush it under the carpet.
Yeah, absolutely. And I read a book recently by a gentleman called Akala. It was called Natives, and it's one of the interesting things when we talk about the way the government discourse might present, inequality and how that works between different groups. That a lot of the time the working class label, if you like, is only ever applied to white people and white working class individuals. And for me, there is an issue that needs to be tackled from these working class, individuals in the communities, perhaps not having access intergenerationally to these resources that allow them to form these future expectations that might be more aligned to higher education. However, yeah, for me, it's a lot more to do with that socio-historical experience, if you like, and that location within multiple generations of inequality, as opposed to and the people that experience that, the large proportions, might also happen to be white, as opposed to we've got these white students, and what is it about them being white that makes this an issue for them? And I think it's a very easy and individualized discourse to slip into, but actually it's not very helpful, because a lot of this is class-based inequality. And if you start having those conversations, then it's almost it's quite oppositional, because of the discourse suggesting that you've got a white group over here and a different group over here, and who deserves a slice of the pie, almost, when actually it's class-based inequality. And there's a lot larger structural issues that surround this that need to be addressed, and perhaps a focus on that model of cultural racial viewfinder, I guess, and focusing on that and privileging that as the issue is something that could detract away from the real underlying causes a little bit.
Yeah. And what you just mentioned in terms of those underlying there, so there must be a correlation between the towns and cities, sort of former mining cities or places where there was big factories and so on, and there's been a knock-on generational effect. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And now if you look at deindustrialization, it was really interesting with one of the core participants and their social networks that I was speaking to, because obviously, for the students, the place that they go to for their advice and guidance is to family members. They're going to trust the people that are closest to them. And for this one individual, you had an elderly grandmother who, when she was growing up at school, rationing was still going on after the Second World War, still very, very industrialized kind of society that she was growing up in. Then you had the mother that was kind of on the cusp, growing up and attending school in perhaps the late 90s, where things had started to look a lot different. And then you had this participant who was navigating his way through education now, and it was really interesting hearing within the interviews with the members of the social network the experiences that they drew on when they spoke about their articulations of how they went about finding work, and perhaps the advice that they would give that were based on these different kind of experiences of a society and a socioeconomic climate that has perhaps shifted. And you develop your views and will give advice based on your experiences. And actually, if your experiences are based in work in a society that's changed significantly, then they're going to be very, very different to things in a contemporary context. And Bourdieu's got a term called, I never know whether it's hysteresis or hysteresis, but essentially what Bourdieu argues is that there's this kind of structural lag where the rules of the game, due to, say, economic change, might shift significantly, but actually it's the middle class individuals perhaps who are able to mobilize and accrue those resources to keep up with those changes, and perhaps individuals whose access to different forms of capital doesn't quite align with that kind of fall behind, and it creates this kind of disjuncture. There's a sociologist called Kieran Burke who did a conference presentation, and he kind of gave the analogy of a square peg and a round hole.
Yes.
So, and it actually being that the advice based on experiences and the resources that you have at your disposal would be perfect for, say, an industrialized economic context. But now we look 30 years down the line, actually there's that lag behind due to the mechanisms which allow those resources and to be accessed by perhaps working class communities, and perhaps specifically in like you said, ex-mining towns, areas like the Black Country, areas of South Wales, etc., north of England.
Now, I just wondered if there was also still a gender issue as well, amongst working class males, to be a provider, instant gratification to start earning as soon as you can. Does that expectation still exist?
Within the research that I conducted, that expectation and the discourse, and when kind of that breadwinner version of masculinity, if you like, was discussed, there was elements of that, specifically actually within kind of the slightly older members of the social network. For the students that were currently navigating their kind of future education, if you like, they based their decisions on what they saw as the most likely course of action, and actually again risk played a lot within that. So one of the participants actually had cousins who were involved in politics locally. They had opportunities to gain a lot of different experiences that provided very valuable social and cultural capital. And actually there was an expectation kind of from that individual that they were probably going to do okay in their GCSEs. Interestingly, these two core participants had roughly similar predicted grades, but actually the other participant had a real fear about GCSEs and about the grades that they were likely to get, and the outcome from that. Within their social network, there'd been a history of experience where perhaps things hadn't gone too well educationally or with exams, and there was a lot of anxiety there and a lot of kind of distrust with the educational institution, the school as well. So whilst one participant was basing their future plans on kind of an expectation of success, the other individual was basing their future plans on an expectation of not passing GCSEs and contingency planning straight away. Not following that discourse of reach for the stars, because actually the levels of anxiety and risks inherent for that student meant that they could not necessarily conceive a future that was aligned to educational success.
That's really interesting. I think Willis refers to it as fatalism, doesn't he? The expectation that you're not going to pass, or the expectation that you're going to fail, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we're talking, I mean, increasingly, in contemporary society, then I'm a professional experience, I will be working sometimes with students of primary school age, year 8, year 9, to start getting them thinking about the future in education and work and how it all works, with very good intentions of equipping these students with tools to be able to mobilize later on down the line to do that effectively. But there's also a considerable amount of pressure, especially if perhaps members of your social network also have those negative experiences of education, where actually it's been something that's difficult and uncomfortable, and it hasn't been something that's led on to social mobility. Actually, all of those experiences are quite negative.
Yeah. So what were your kind of overall findings from the research, Alex? Maybe we could finish with that and as a final question.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the big ones, and one of the ones that was really interesting, was the approach with the institution itself, so the institution of the school. As I say, amongst the discourse of the participants, there was a real strong kind of agenda coming through around raising aspiration and getting these students kind of to reach for the stars, if you like, and aspire towards that geographically and socially mobile educational trajectory. And there's been an awful lot of research that suggests that actually raising aspiration isn't an agenda or a discourse that's particularly helpful, and in some cases then it can be quite harmful. It was also interesting at the school that at the same time there was this other discourse that came through from the teachers where they were talking about the pastoral side, helping the students individually and working within their community context. That means they found something that was right for them. And a lot of the time, those two things were almost at loggerheads, and there was this kind of paradox that was going on within the institution, and that real tension there, which was absolutely fascinating. On the student side of things, then the way that I conceptualized it kind of within my findings chapter of the thesis was as a tightrope. And on one side, like I mentioned, you had that kind of embedded choice, the one that was most familiar, that all of the resources to achieve were easily accessible. And on the other end of this tightrope was that contingent choice, which was that aspiration of geographic and social mobility and, attending this Russell Group university. And what I found within the research is that the core participants got to varying stages along this tightrope based on the access that they had and the ability to mobilize social, cultural, and economic resources. And within certainly Mr. D, the teacher, it was really, really interesting because what you found there was it could be argued, he'd stayed local, he'd become a teacher at a school, he'd achieved that change in profession, which could delineate perhaps social mobility, but actually, he hadn't moved away geographically, he hadn't gone down to Oxford to carry on his career. Actually, what he'd done was gone to a local university, he stayed at home, he'd strategically gathered and accrued those resources that he would need to then go on to do his PGCE and qualify as a teacher, but he hadn't done it in a way which meant, and it quite often happens kind of within transition to higher education that's been explored, he hadn't lost any of his social ties through
Yes.
that. He'd done it in a way that he was able to still talk to his friends and family. He spoke in the interview about friends that he's had right since he was school age, and mentioned that not very many of them went on to higher education. And the way that he navigated his kind of trajectory through higher education and into this, sorry, I'm holding up inverted commas fingers, but I know you can't see, kind of socially mobile, but position as a teacher in the school, but keeping local, he'd managed to kind of reconcile the two. Again, Nicola Ingram, when she's talking about those transitions, she uses the term a reconciled habitus, where it was able to successfully incorporate kind of the new stuff that's come with class transition and social mobility, and the stuff that comes from kind of your working class background, your social networks and all those forms of capital that were available there.
Yeah.
They were the two big things. I think the big thing with my findings was that a lot of the time when you talk about widening participation and higher education, then it's done on a very individualized basis, and it's done that's talking about individual aspiration or individual attainment. I think the conceptualization of that tightrope allows all of those structural kind of negotiations that go on, and all of those access to different forms of capital that you need in order to change something from this abstract hope or ambition to an expectation. There was a light that was able to be shined on that as well.
Yeah, I like the tightrope analogy. That works really well. Alex, could I ask you just to finish off? I always ask people to let the listeners know if they want to find out more about your work or get in touch. How could they do that, please?
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter. It's at EduDetective, so you can find me there, tweeting away. Also, I've got a YouTube channel that I do various bits and bobs with vlogs. Some of them are student focused and looking at, different bits and bobs that would be useful to know or to discuss about access to higher education. And then I've got some more stuff that touches on my research and, different bits of writing that I'm doing or things that I might be interested in exploring further as well. And so it's a real ambition of mine to bridge the gap a bit between, people doing practice in the area of education that I work in and people doing research. So that YouTube channel allows me to do that a little bit.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for your time today, Alex. I really, really appreciate it. And best wishes for the future with all your future research as well.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
The Sociology Show podcast relies on the kind contributions of sponsorship and donations. If you enjoy the show, then you can help with the hosting costs by donating as little as £5 on the GoFundMe page. Simply visit uk.gofundme.com and search for The Sociology Show. If you can donate, then you will be sent a Sociology Show pen as a small thank you for your continued support of the show.